Sophia had always believed that love was more than wealth, status, or social expectations. Born into a prestigious family, she had every privilege life could offer. Yet her heart longed for something deeper, something real. When she met James, a homeless black man with kind eyes and an unbreakable spirit, she saw not his worn-out clothes but the strength in his soul. Against all odds, she chose love over judgment, compassion over convention. But as she walked down the aisle, she had no idea that her wedding day would bring a revelation so profound that it would change everything she thought she knew about life, love, and fate. Sophia had always believed that love was more than wealth, status, or social expectations. Born into a prestigious family, she had every privilege life could offer, yet her heart longed for something deeper, something real. When she met James, a homeless black man with kind eyes and an unbreakable spirit, she saw not his worn-out clothes but the strength in his soul. Against all odds, she chose love over judgment, compassion over convention. But as she walked down the aisle, she had no idea that her wedding day would bring a revelation so profound that it would change everything she thought she knew about life, love, and fate. The grand ballroom, adorned with crystal chandeliers and fresh white roses, was filled with murmurs of disbelief. Guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits whispered behind lace-gloved hands and polished champagne glasses. Sophia's parents, sitting in the front row, wore expressions of forced composure, their tight-lipped smiles unable to mask the tension in their eyes. James stood at the altar, his posture proud despite the many disapproving gazes. His suit was borrowed, slightly loose at the shoulders, but his presence was undeniable. He was not ashamed of his past, nor intimidated by the wealth surrounding him. As Sophia walked toward him, her heart pounded. She knew love was never easy, but she hadn't expected the hostility to be this strong. Just as she reached James and took his hands in hers, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Stop this wedding!" Gasps filled the room. Sophia turned sharply to see an older man standing at the back of the hall. His face was weathered with age, yet his eyes held a striking resemblance to James's. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. James's hands tightened around Sophia's. His breath hitched, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "Dad?" James's voice was barely above a whisper. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. His father? But James had always told her he had no family. What was the truth? And what secret had just stepped into their wedding? The ballroom fell into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to the older man standing near the entrance, his breathing ragged as if he had rushed to get there. His dark suit was slightly wrinkled and his silver-streaked hair was unkempt, but his presence commanded attention. James stood frozen, his grip on Sophia's hands tightening. "Dad?" His voice wavered. Sophia's pulse raced. "James told me he had no family, that he had been alone for years, so who was this man?" The stranger took a step forward, his eyes locked onto James with an intensity that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. "I had to find you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't let you go through this without knowing the truth." James's jaw clenched. "The truth? The truth is, you abandoned me. You left me and Mom to fend for ourselves." His voice cracked, filled with years of pain. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some were fascinated by the unexpected drama, others clearly uncomfortable. Sophia's parents sat stiffly in their seats, her mother gripping the edge of her purse as if willing herself to remain silent. The older man exhaled shakily. "Son, I didn't abandon you. You were taken from me." James's face twisted in disbelief. "Taken? That's a lie. I grew up watching Mom struggle. I begged on the streets. Where were you?" "I was searching for you." The man's voice broke. "For years. Your mother, she left with you when you were just a boy. She thought she was protecting you, but she never told me where she went." He stepped closer, his eyes glistening. "James, I swear I never stopped looking." Sophia felt James's grip tremble. She could sense the storm of emotions raging inside him. For as long as she had known him, James had never spoken about his father. He had only ever described a childhood filled with hardship, his mother doing everything she could to keep them afloat until she eventually passed away. Now standing before them was a man claiming to be his father, a man who had been searching for him all this time. "Why should I believe you?" James's voice was hoarse. The older man pulled something from his coat pocket, a small, tattered photograph. He held it out, his hands shaking. James hesitated, then took it. As his eyes scanned the image, Sophia saw his breath hitch. She leaned closer. The photograph was old, faded at the edges, but the image was clear. A young boy, no older than 4, sitting on a man's lap. The man had the same deep-set eyes as James, the same strong jawline. And the boy, it was undeniably James. Sophia covered her mouth. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. James swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the photograph. He looked up at the man who had just shattered everything he thought he knew about his past. And for the first time in his life, James wasn't sure what to believe. James's fingers trembled as he clutched the photograph. His eyes darted between the worn image and the man standing before him. The resemblance was undeniable, but could he trust it? Could he trust him? Sophia felt his tension through their clasped hands. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so lost. The confident, resilient man she loved now stood at a crossroads between his past and his future. The guests remained silent, their gazes locked on the unfolding drama. Even Sophia's parents, who had been prepared to object to the wedding on their own terms, sat speechless. James's voice was barely above a whisper. "If you were searching for me, why now? Why today?" The older man swallowed hard. "Because I only found out you were alive yesterday." James's breath hitched. "What?" The man's eyes were filled with sorrow. "I had hired private investigators for years, but they always came up with nothing. Your mother, she disappeared so completely. I thought..." His voice cracked. "I thought you both were gone." Sophia's chest tightened. The raw pain in his voice was real. This wasn't an act. "I didn't stop looking," he continued. "And then, just yesterday, one of my investigators found something. A name. Your name. And I learned that you were alive, that you were getting married today." He let out a breath. "I flew here the moment I heard." James's expression was unreadable. "And what? You expect me to welcome you with open arms? To believe that after all these years you suddenly care?" The man's eyes softened. "I never stopped caring." He took a hesitant step forward. "James, I'm not just here to find you. I'm here to tell you the truth about who you are." Sophia frowned. "Who he is?" James narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The older man hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. Then, with a deep breath, he said, "Your mother wasn't just running from me. She was running from my family." Sophia felt James stiffen beside her. "What do you mean?" A heavy pause filled the air. Then the man spoke words that made Sophia's entire body freeze. "James, you are the heir to a vast fortune. You come from one of the wealthiest families in the country." The room erupted into gasps. Sophia felt her heart drop. James, homeless James, the man she loved, the man who had spent his life struggling to survive, was secretly a billionaire's heir. James let out a hollow laugh. "That's insane. You expect me to believe that?" The man nodded solemnly. "It's the truth." James shook his head in disbelief. "Then why was I left to suffer? If my family was so wealthy, why didn't anyone find me sooner?" The older man's eyes darkened. "Because they didn't want you found." Silence fell over the room. Sophia's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. The man exhaled sharply. "James's mother took him and ran because she knew the truth. If my family found him, they would have taken him away. They would have raised him under their control, molded him into their version of an heir. His jaw tightened. Your mother didn't want that for you, James. She wanted you to have a choice. She wanted you to live free. James was shaking his head as if trying to process too much at once. This can't be real. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing an ornate gold ring with an intricate crest. This belonged to my father. It was meant to be passed down to you. James stared at the ring as if it were a foreign object. Sophia could barely breathe. Everything was changing. Her wedding day had started as a moment of defiance, proof that love was more powerful than wealth, than society, than expectations. But now, James was no longer just a homeless man. He was an heir to a fortune, and somewhere, out there, a powerful family had been keeping secrets. But why? The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. All eyes were on James, who stood motionless, staring at the gold ring in the man's hand. The weight of the revelation hung over him like a storm cloud. Sophia squeezed his hand. James, she whispered, trying to ground him in reality. But was anything real anymore? James finally let out a bitter laugh. So let me get this straight. I spent years on the streets starving, struggling, begging, while my so-called family lived in luxury. His voice was sharp, filled with the pain of a lifetime of suffering. And you expect me to accept this? The older man's face darkened. I don't expect anything, son. I came to tell you the truth, and to warn you. James narrowed his eyes. Warn me? About what? The man's gaze swept across the room, as if checking for unseen threats. Then he lowered his voice. Your mother ran for a reason, James. She knew that if my family found you, they would do whatever it took to ensure you followed their rules. They don't tolerate defiance. They don't tolerate weakness. His jaw tightened. And if they knew you were alive, they would destroy you before letting you inherit anything. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying they would hurt him? The man met her eyes. They've done worse for less. A hushed gasp spread through the guests. The grandeur of the ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. James's face was unreadable. Then why tell me? Why bring me back into their world if they're so dangerous? The man exhaled. Because they already know. A sharp pang of dread settled in Sophia's stomach. They know you're alive. They know you're getting married today. His voice dropped. And they're watching. Sophia's breath hitched. Watching? She turned instinctively, scanning the crowd. The elegant guests, the sparkling chandeliers, the rows of pristine white chairs. It all suddenly felt like a carefully curated illusion. James's fists clenched. You mean to tell me there are people here, in this room, who want to harm me? The man nodded grimly. Yes, and they won't stop until you either submit to them or disappear. Sophia's heart pounded. This was no longer just a shocking family secret. This was a threat. James took a deep breath, his entire body tense. Then let them come, he said darkly. I've survived worse. The man's expression was pained. I don't want you to just survive, James. I want you to win. Sophia spoke up, her voice stronger than she expected. Then tell us how. How do we fight them? The older man's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Regret? Hope? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. This is everything you need to know. Every secret, every weakness, every lie they've built to keep control. He hesitated before handing it to James. But if you take this, there's no going back. James took the envelope without hesitation. And just as he did, a loud crash echoed through the ballroom. The doors swung open violently. Men in dark suits stepped inside, their faces unreadable, their presence radiating power. The air turned ice cold. Sophia's grip tightened around James's arm. It was too late. They had arrived. The doors slammed open with a force that sent a chilling silence through the ballroom. The men in dark suits stepped inside, their polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. Their presence was suffocating, cold, calculated, and full of authority. Sophia felt her heart hammering. James's grip on the envelope tightened. From the center of the group, an older man emerged. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp, predatory gaze swept across the room before landing on James. He adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored suit, exuding an aura of control. "James," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something sinister. "It's been a long time." James didn't flinch. "I don't know you." The man chuckled. "Of course you don't. But I know you. And I know what your mother tried to do. She thought she could keep you hidden forever." His eyes darkened. "She failed?" Sophia felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. These people forced James's mother to run. They forced him to suffer, and now they had the audacity to show up here as if they owned him. James took a step forward, his voice steady. "You let me rot on the streets while you sat in your mansions, and now you think you can just walk in and claim me?" He scoffed. "I don't want your name. I don't want your money." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the problem, James. It's not about what you want. It's about what you are." James clenched his fists. "And what's that?" The man's gaze sharpened. "The rightful heir. The only person standing between us and complete control. Your father may have been weak, but he was still one of us. And so are you, whether you like it or not." James let out a bitter laugh. "And if I refuse?" The man's smile vanished. "Then you won't live long enough to regret it." Gasps rippled through the guests. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. James's father stepped forward, placing himself between his son and the man. "You won't touch him," he said firmly. He said. The older man chuckled. "And how do you plan to stop us?" He motioned to his men. "Take him." Everything happened in a blur. The suited men advanced, their movements precise, rehearsed. Sophia grabbed James's hand, pulling him back. His father tried to block them, but he was outnumbered. James acted on instinct. With a swift motion, he grabbed a champagne bottle from the nearest table and swung it at the first man who reached for him. The glass shattered, sending shards flying. The man staggered back, blood trickling down his forehead. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed. Tables overturned. Sophia barely had time to react before James yanked her hand and ran. They sprinted toward the side exit, dodging panicked guests. The men in suits pursued them, their heavy footsteps closing in. James's father held off as many as he could, shouting, "Get out of here! Find a way to fight back!" Sophia's heart pounded as they burst through the doors and into the night. The city lights flickered around them, the cold air biting at her skin. James didn't stop running. "We need to disappear," he panted. Sophia looked at him, her chest heaving. "And then what?" James slowed to a stop. He turned to her, his dark eyes filled with determination. "We don't run forever," he said. "We fight." He opened the envelope. Inside were documents, bank statements, offshore accounts, hidden scandals. Evidence of corruption so deep that it could tear his so-called family apart. Sophia's eyes widened. This is enough to destroy them. James exhaled. "Then let's finish this." The headlines were everywhere. Wealthy dynasty exposed in shocking scandal. Illegitimate heir brings down corrupt empire. Once homeless, now a hero, James Carter destroys the family that tried to silence him. James stood at the balcony of their small apartment, looking out at the city. He was no longer running, no longer afraid. Sophia joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We did it," she whispered. He turned to her, smiling. "Yeah, we did." The world knew his name now, not as a forgotten street kid, not as a pawn in a rich man's game, but as the man who stood up and won. And for the first time in his life, James was free,